It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion hosted by the National Bureau of Asian Research on the evolving dynamics in U.S.-South Korea trade and tech relations. I'm Doug Strub, Senior Director of Research and Programs at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Thank you all for joining us today. The technology and trade relationship between the United States and South Korea has become one of the most consequential partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. Anchored not only in alliance politics, but in deeply integrated supply chains, advanced manufacturing ecosystems, and increasingly digital and emerging technologies, Korea's importance as a trade and technology partner can easily be seen across critical sectors such as advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, batteries, and more. But this relationship is undergoing rapid and sometimes uncomfortable shifts. Over the past several years, we have seen an unprecedented convergence of trade policy, national security, industrial strategy, and digital regulation. What was once primarily a market-driven commercial partnership has become deeply embedded in broader geoeconomic and geostrategic competition. As I'm sure you're all aware, there have been a lot of important and ongoing developments in this relationship lately. After extended trade talks last year, there has been a lot of the two governments signed the Technology Prosperity Deal in October and released a joint fact sheet in November outlining the commitments made in the Strategic Trade and Investment Deal. These agreements signaled a shared commitment to advanced technology cooperation and supply chain resilience and indicated positive momentum for the bilateral relationship. Despite this progress, there have still been frictions, with U.S. policymakers expressing frustration over the speed of pledged investments and potential backsliding on the joint fact sheet's commitments to address non-tariff barriers, particularly in the digital sector. These frustrations were made abundantly clear when President Trump posted on January 26 that he would increase tariffs on South Korea to 25% because Korea was moving too slowly to implement the trade deal. The following week, after South Korea's National Assembly committed to fast-tracking this issue, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer similarly informed South Korea's foreign minister that the United States would raise tariffs if Korea failed to quickly address the issues around non-tariff barriers. One area where these broader dynamics are playing out and where non-tariff barriers have been a key sticking point is digital regulation and competition policy, especially regarding enforcement measures from the Korea Fair Trade Commission and the National Assembly's recurring push for platform legislation that many U.S. firms view as unusually discretionary and procedurally imbalanced. Over the past year, the National Bureau of Asian Research has been conducting research on these issues, and we are looking forward to discussing them today. This research was led by NBR Nonresident Fellow Nigel Cory, who will be joining the panel today, and has authored a policy brief and 2 research papers with us over the past several months. The first paper examined the Korea Fair Trade Commission's enforcement actions, and to inform this paper's findings, Nigel and I traveled to Korea last August to interview several U.S. companies and meet with Korean officials to better understand the circumstances on the ground. Companies consistently reported facing issues such as low thresholds for opening investigations, overly aggressive investigative tactics, lack of due process, and more. Nigel will elaborate on these today. And the more recent paper, which came out earlier this week, examines the legislation around digital regulations that forms the foundation of many of the concerns raised by U.S. policymakers. Nigel will also elaborate on this today, but both of these are available on the table out in the lobby, so I would encourage you all to read them. We're also fortunate to be joined by Tami Overby today, who's a member of NBR's Board of Advisors. Tami and I were also recently in Korea and got back 2 weeks ago. During our time there, we met dozens of key stakeholders from government, the private sector, and think tanks to learn more about how they are thinking about and responding to the current developments in U.S.-Korea trade and technology relations. Tami will certainly talk much more about this during the panel, but I wanted to highlight that nearly everyone we met with raised the point that the United States is still their top priority in terms of both the security alliance and as South Korea's most important trade and technology partner. Yet at the same time, there was significant and growing concern over uncertainty relating to tariffs and U.S. trade policy more broadly. And there were many discussions about what this would mean for Korea's strategic approach to global trade and technology relations in the longer term if these challenges and uncertainties are not resolved. So while today's discussion will raise some legitimate concerns over Korean digital regulations and competition policy, We also hope for a constructive conversation that can emphasize productive outcomes to resolve these issues and ensure that the United States continues to strengthen our alliance and find mutually beneficial ways to capitalize on our economic and technological complementarities. Lastly, I just want to highlight quick that due to a last-minute emergency, our third panelist was unfortunately unable to make it, but I assure you, you're in good hands with Nigel and Tami today. And I would like to also introduce my colleague, Jonathon Marek, who will be moderating, and he leads our technology and geoeconomic affairs work. So with that, I will turn it over to the panel.
Thanks, Doug. Doug briefly introduced these two speakers who require no introduction, but I'll give them one nonetheless. So first, Tami Overby, partner at DGA Group Government Relations, where she draws on over 30 years of experience working in Asia to advise her clients on trade and investment matters in South Korea and regionally. As Doug mentioned, she's also a valued member of NBR's Board of Advisors. Previously, she was Senior Director at McClarty Associates, and prior to that, Senior Vice President for Asia and President of the U.S. Korea Business Council. Earlier in her career, she spent 14 years as President of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, where she supported the completion and ratification of the Chorus trade agreement. She currently sits on the boards of the Korea Society and the U.S. Asia Institute. And then Nigel Cory is Director of Digital Trade and Technology Policy at Crowell Global Advisors, where he focuses on cross-border data flows, data and digital governance, intellectual property, and how they relate to digital trade and the overall digital economy. He regularly provides testimony and publishes reports on these issues, including the many that he has done and is doing for NBR, where, as Doug mentioned, he's a non-resident fellow. Previously, he held positions at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's a member of the UK's International Data Transfer Expert Council and the OECD Data Free Flow with Trust Expert Community. He holds a bachelor's from Griffith University in Brisbane and a master's from Georgetown University. With that, I will turn it over to Tami to kick us off with a few minutes of framing remarks.
Thanks. First, I want to start with Nigel also wears cool socks. Very important. I want to thank NBR for this timely program. And to sort of set the scene, I'm going to give you a little history lesson, but I'll be quick. The Korean War ended, or it began on June 21st, 1950. An armistice was signed 2 years later, or 3 years later, July 27th in 1953. But no peace treaty has ever been signed. So technically, the Korean War has never ended. When the guns fell silent, South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth. The landscape was stripped bare, forests were destroyed, infrastructure shattered, industry non-existent. If you fly over the country today in a helicopter, as I've had the good fortune to do, you'll notice something remarkable. All of the trees are planted in straight lines. Johnny Kim hand-planted each one of those trees. They were rebuilt. The country was rebuilt tree by a nation that refused to accept devastation as destiny. South Korea has no meaningful natural resources. Its landmass is small, relatively the same size as the state of Indiana. Yet today, with a population of over 51 million people, it stands as one of the world's most dynamic economies. Just 73 years after the war, South Korea has become a global leader in shipbuilding, autos, electric vehicle batteries, semiconductors, consumer electronics, smartphones, displays, home appliances. It's also at the forefront of AI, 5G, advanced manufacturing, and hydrogen technology. And beyond industry, it's a cultural powerhouse. K-pop, K-drama, K-food, K-beauty shape global trends from Los Angeles to London. Its democracy, however, is young. Only since 1987 has South Korea been governed through a full democratic elections. In historical terms, that's just a single generation. And yet, in December 2024, that young democracy faced its most serious test in decades. After 10:30 p.m. on December 3rd, 2024, former President Yoon Suk-yeol unexpectedly declared martial law. Troops surrounded the National Assembly. Plans reportedly included detaining key political figures from both major political parties. What happened next was extraordinary. Within hours, 190 of the 300 members of the National Assembly gathered and unanimously voted to strike down the martial law declaration, forcing President Yoon to rescind it. Days later, on December 14th, 2024, the National Assembly impeached the president. That decision was upheld by the Supreme Court on April 4th, and on February 19th of this year, he was sentenced to life in prison. The system worked, the Constitution held, the military obeyed civilian authority. For a democracy only 39 years old, this was not fragility, this was resilience. At the same time, South Korea was serving as the host of the 2025 Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, a regional forum of 21 economies representing nearly half of global trade. And hosting APEC is not just a symbolic event. It requires more than 200 meetings over the course of a year, advancing trade liberalization, investment flows, supply chain resilience, and sustainable growth. South Korea managed this entire process successfully for more than half a year without an elected president. That is institutional strength. Sorry, question. Okay, yeah, hold on. Sorry. I haven't slept in a while, so y'all got to forgive me. President Lee Jae-myung was elected on June 3rd, 2025. He took office the next day, no transition period. By the end of the year, South Korea had delivered one of the most effective APEC host years in recent memory. All this unfolded amid significant turbulence in the U.S.-Korea relationship. As President Donald Trump began his second term, tariffs returned to the forefront of U.S. trade policy. On April 2nd, 2025, Liberation Day, a 10% baseline tariff was imposed globally, with higher country-specific rates. South Korea initially received a 25% tariff. Following President Lee's second summit with President Trump on October 29, 2025 at APEC, that rate was reduced to 15%. After Korea committed to a $350 billion investment package, including $150 billion dedicated to shipbuilding. Japan and the EU reached similar arrangements. In early 2026, frustration emerged in Washington over delays of the Korean National Assembly approving legislation for the investment package. With a Truth Social post, President Trump threatened to restore the 25% tariff, but no formal action followed. On February 20th, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the reciprocal tariff framework. That same day, the administration imposed a temporary 10% global tariffs under Section 122 authority, valid for 150 days, 5 months, and is expected to transition to Section 301 measures. Meanwhile, broader areas of friction persist. Ongoing Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and autos, potential 301 investigations targeting digital service, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals, pressure surrounding Korea's $350 billion investment pledge, U.S. demands for increased host nation support for the 28,500 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. Questions surrounding extended deterrence and burden sharing, divergence over North Korean policy, dialogue versus rigidity, and Korea's ambitions in nuclear-powered submarines and expanded nuclear fuel cycle rights. The partnership between the United States and South Korea technology, however, is robust and multifaceted. Here are some notable examples. In semiconductors, first of all, I want to say thanks to Samsung because they're investing hundreds of billions of dollars in the U.S., bringing their latest and greatest technology here and creating tens of thousands of well-paying 21st century jobs for Americans. Thank you very much, Scott. I know you did it all yourself. Semiconductors, U.S. companies like Intel and Qualcomm collaborate with South Korean firms like Samsung, like SK Hynix in the semiconductor sector. This partnership enhances innovation and production capabilities in semiconductor chips that power various devices. We collaborate on 5G technologies. Both countries are actively working together to develop and implement 5G networks. Companies like Verizon and AT&T have partnered with South Korean players like LG and Samsung to advance 5G infrastructure. AI. The U.S. and South Korea have joint ventures focusing on AI research and development. Initiatives include academic collaborations and investments in AI startups by U.S. firms in South Korea. We're also working together in cybersecurity. There are partnerships between agencies such as the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and South Korea's Ministry of Science and ICT, aimed at enhancing cybersecurity measures and combating cyber threats. We're also working together in space exploration. NASA has collaborated with South Korea's Korea Aerospace Research Institute, or KARI, on satellite technology and space exploration efforts. Renewable energy. U.S. companies are working with South Korea in renewable energy sectors focus on advancements in solar and wind technologies, including joint research projects, and also on automotive technology. U.S. automakers like General Motors work with South Korean companies to develop advanced automotive technologies, including electric vehicles and autonomous driving systems. These partnerships are indicative of the strong technological bonds between our two countries, fostering innovations and mutual growth. So that's the good news, but there's some challenges. One challenge I want to mention is Coupang. Now, to many of the Americans in the room, Coupang is not a company we grew up knowing. But for most South Koreans, they know Coupang intimately. Coupang was born in Korea, but it is now, they've moved the headquarters. It's domiciled in Delaware, headquartered in Seattle, and is on the New York Stock Exchange. Now, Coupang is an online platform company, and really they don't have any competition in Korea. I mean, there are other companies who do it, but Coupang has their algorithms and their logistic special knowledge has made them really the company of choice for most Koreans. My sister used to live in Korea, so when I would visit her at night, at 10 o'clock, I'd look in her refrigerator and there's no cream for my coffee. I can't drink coffee without cream. She would get online with Coupang, and at 6 a.m., there's some fresh cream outside my door. Why can't Amazon do that? Anyway, on November 29th, Coupang announced a data leak. Now, this data leak affected the data of 33 million Koreans. Their data was accessed. And recently, like this year, we learned that 200,000 Taiwanese citizens' data was also accessed in this leak. But the data that was accessed is phone numbers, addresses, the last 5 things you bought from Coupang, and if you live in an apartment building, maybe the security code to get into the building, so that, like at my sister's house, she lives in a tower, and they had to get into the building so they could drop that cream for my coffee right outside the door. I don't want to go downstairs. The Coupang made sure I didn't have to. So that data, according to the SEC, is non-sensitive data. It didn't have Korean ID numbers. It didn't have credit card numbers. And Coupang then hired two of the world's leading cybersecurity companies and had them do a deep dive on the dark web. I don't even know what that is, but apparently that's where bad stuff happens, and that's where when I get scammed, and I'm old, so I do get scammed, my stuff ends up on that dark web. Well, according to Mondiant's the only company I can remember, but they had two of them, double checking to see has any financial damage been done to anybody as a result of these data leaks? And the answer is no. And that seems to be undisputed by the Korean government. Now, again, Coupang notified the government on November 29th. Right now, between the between the Korean government and Coupang, there's some disagreements. Now, I don't profess to know what's right or wrong here, but I'm just going to give you, an old woman who has spent 38 years of her life studying U.S. Korea and Korea very closely. And what I will tell you is I have never seen the Korean government come together so quickly and so completely against one company. On Christmas Day, so November 29th, they informed of the data leak. On Christmas Day, President Lee Jae-myung held an emergency meeting at the Blue House on Coupang and apparently said some inflammatory things. And then on December 30th and December 31st, at the National Assembly, there was a 2-day hearing on Coupang. And at that hearing, 6 of the 17 committees at the National Assembly joined together, again, to look at Coupang. 11 different regulatory bodies are now investigating Coupang. And of those 11, 9 of them don't have anything to do with data or cybersecurity. They're being investigated by the tax people, the labor people, the customs people, the FSS, the financial people. Pretty much anybody who can investigate them is investigating them. Now, Coupang is not the only company in Korea to have a data leak. But I have, when SK or when KT had their data leaks, I didn't see anything like this happen. So when my Korean friends tell me they're not discriminating or treating Coupang any differently than any other company, I have to dispute that because my experience shows me it's a little bit different. So this issue, and again, at full disclosure, I am one of Coupang's many consultants in Washington, so they're one of my clients, as are a few of the tech companies in the room. But what I will tell you is, again, I think that both sides have made mistakes in this. For my Coupang friends, and they don't want to hear it, but it's my opinion, and everyone's got one, I believe Coupang has made a mistake by not having its founder, Kim Bum-suk, the gentleman who started the company, the genius behind the company, ignore the National Assembly's summons. He's been summoned several times, and he's not gone. He doesn't live in Korea. He is trying to build a global company. Again, they are now in Taiwan, they're in Japan, and they're moving throughout Asia. So he is trying to take that model and grow it all over the world. And excuse me, so he hasn't gone to the National Assembly. I think that's a mistake. And I say that because when SK had their data leak, their chairman, Chae Tae-won, was summoned to the National Assembly. He went, he did the low bow, he did the Korean apology, and he didn't get all this extra attention. When Samsung created some problem, J.Y. Lee went to and he was summoned. He went to the National Assembly and did the Korean thing. So I think it would be helpful if the chairman would do that. Now again, I'm saying both sides have made some mistakes. But right now, what I encourage both sides is that Korea needs Coupang and Coupang needs Korea. 90% of Coupang's revenue is coming from South Korea. And for South Korea, this is, as far as online platforms, 33 million of your citizens were using it. And a lot of small and medium-sized Korean companies are using it to get to those 51 million companies, or 51 million consumers. You know who else is using it? Over $5 billion of American exporters. If you go to Coupang's office in DC on Pennsylvania Avenue, you'll see a bunch of very recognizable American logos. Nike, Heinz Ketchup, I mean, any logo you can think of, they're on that wall. And Coupang is helping all of those American companies sell into Korea through the Coupang app. So every member of Congress practically has a Coupang company, an American company in their district that is selling in Korea. So every member of Congress cares about this issue. And again, as I mentioned, they got a lot of consultants. Some of them are really good. Every member of Congress, the administration, the media, Americans now know who Coupang is. But they know it in terms of, oh, it feels like the Korean government is not treating them fairly. That's what Ambassador Greer has said. That's what J.D. Vance has said. That's what several members of Congress have said. So to both the company and to the country, I'm saying y'all need to start talking and find a constructive solution. You need each other. It's a symbiotic relationship. And on that happy note, I'm going to turn it over to Nigel.
Thanks for that tour de force of the historical and contemporary context of what we're dealing with, and maybe picking up where she left off in terms of the symbiotic relationship. The reason why we care about these issues, which may seem a little esoteric, is because of the nature, the depth and breadth of the bilateral relationship, which for me goes back to being a young intern for Samsung Electronics while I was doing my undergraduate at Griffith University 20 odd years ago. So I was a Samsung man for a brief period of time. And so to build on Tami's points, I focused more specifically on the rules around which trade has been conducted between the US and Korea as a part of these NBR projects we've done, which in all of my time working on digital and technology policy issues, I found particularly interesting because it allowed us to dive into the sort of qualitative impact of non-tariff digital barriers in a way that is really hard in many markets and contexts. And so this allowed us to bring these details to life, obviously during a particularly challenging context with bilateral relations. But I think my starting point here is that when we look at US-Korea competition and non-tariff digital barriers in Korea, these are not new issues. Korea was actually the first in terms of US trade partners with digital-related provisions in its trade agreement. But subsequently, since then, there's been sort of a growing number of bilateral irritants in Korea that US firms have felt that they are being unfairly singled and targeted, even though they have chorus and this obviously broader beneficial bilateral trade relationship. And so these aren't new issues. There's obviously a new context and a new focus on digital non-tariff barriers in the Trump administration, but these are not new. We have more recent sort of context and incidents in and around it, but again, these are not new issues. And the challenge especially being, as I lay out in the most recent article for NBR on the Korean sort of Online Fairness Act, is that new pieces of legislation stand the risk of compounding sort of existing discriminatory concerns that US firms have in Korea. And that's the context of it. But before diving into it, I just wanted to reiterate what Tami was saying, in that while the Trump administration has clearly prioritized digital trade barriers, Europe's often thought of as the main target. But in many regards, Korea sort of has set itself apart in what it's done. And in some regards, it's out-EU'd the EU in some regards. And there's been a pattern of behaviour there that makes it particularly concerning, and especially as they consider new legislation. And as Tami mentioned, I had the honour of testifying in Congress a month ago on digital trade. I was surprised that I had more questions about Korea than I did the EU, which I thought was telling. And there are a range of very specific issues in Korea that lend itself to the type of trade talks that we're seeing now, to in that US firms see an opportunity to finally address some of these long-standing concerns they have. Starting with the first report we did in terms of Korea's sort of existing application of competition policy with the KFTC, in that what we have now is a pattern of behaviour whereby the KFTC has targeted US firms in a way that is separate and different to obviously how it treats other Korean firms. And it was really surprising as we were doing the research for this project and interviewing US firms, they started laughing after we sort of gave them our sort of working hypothesis of the research in saying that, oh, you've already read our homework. Like, they all had exactly the same complaints, regardless of sector or issue or presence in Korea. Like, their treatment by the KFTC, their unfair treatment by the KFTC was broadly felt amongst these US firms. And despite the fact that they're always nervous about being targeted again, that they were happy and willing to talk with us as a part of this project because this issue has been impacting them for so long. And so they were happy for the opportunity to highlight their concerns and obviously for us to bring sort of this evidence into the current debate and the current negotiations. In summary, basically, what US firms face with the KFTC are more institutional issues as opposed to the specific application of the law in terms of low threshold for new investigations, a lack of transparency about what they're actually being investigated for when investigations are launched. So US firms don't know what they're defending themselves against. The fact that the KFTC loves a good dawn raid where they storm an office, seize office space, computers, people, equipment, files and everything else in a way that sort of sets itself apart from other global best practice. A core part of what US firms face is during the course of these uncertain investigations, US firms have little access to sort of legal redress to defend themselves against overly broad investigations, seizure of data and information, seizing of staff and office space and such that US firms face a real sort of market impact and reputational impact as they go through this, and their first defence against it comes after the fact, after the KFTC has concluded their investigation. And so that makes it really hard for them to continue to operate in Korea as they otherwise would, especially when they basically assume that they're going to be under constant investigation, or if they're not under constant investigation, they start to get nervous because they suspect one must be coming. That was the general broad sentiment of US firms in Korea of how they're specifically targeted by the KFTC. Which leads us to the more recent piece of legislation around the Online Platform Fairness Act, which is the culmination of over 6 years of deliberations and stop-start reforms in and around the broad concept of sort of platform behaviour. And it's sort of, the bill itself has metastasised from a bill that was originally influenced by the EU Digital Markets Act that was initially stopped and redrawn and revised through several sort of corporate incidents that at each point Korean policymakers took up the legislation again in some sort of slightly different way to revise it and redevelop it in some way to address sometimes the root concern of the corporate incident, or sometimes just to, I think, where we've ended up, provide another tool for them, or for more likely the KFTC, to investigate some of the major tech firms in Korea, most of which are American. And the fact that, to Tami's point, this isn't a new thing. This platform proposal has been in the works in one way, shape or form for over 6 years. But the fact that it was reintroduced and re-upped in the context of current trade talks and trade conflict is telling. And I can't see it as being anything else but a provocation, given obviously the commitments Korea made in the statement with the United States not to enact laws and regulations that discriminate against US firms. The fact that that this law was allowed to be released and for it to be sort of put in the current context, I mean, can't be seen as anything else but sort of an aggravation of the already sort of high drama we're seeing around digital non-tariff trade barriers in Korea. And so that puts us in a specific pickle as to how do we get these two really deeply connected sort of partners on digital and high technology sectors together on some of these sort of more foundational elements, on some of these more long-standing irritants, so that the two sides can focus on what they both do very well in digital and advanced technologies. And we haven't seen them square the circle on this issue yet. And it's hard to see how they get at it in the context of this new platform bill, which only builds on or only compounds US firms' concerns about the KFTC. So the Fairness Act is problematic both in terms of its substance but also its operations. The substance of it, it's a funny bill in that it gets at settlement dynamics, refunds and redress, payment gateways, in terms of how firms, many SMEs, use platforms and what the relationship is with the major platforms. So it's mainly a financial sort of transactional relationship element to it. But it's been delegated essentially to the KFTC to look at and to regulate through a broad fairness lens. And so there's a problem with the mechanics of it, of what it does, how it does it, the uncertainty about what it's trying to go after. But the fact that it empowers the KFTC is what makes it particularly concerning from a US perspective, because it still doesn't address any of the underlying concerns that US firms have about the lack of procedural fairness and the lack of access to legal redress as the KFTC does what it does. And so the prospect of giving the KFTC these really broad new powers with major fines on top of what the KFTC already does is really concerning. And so that's the long story of it. And so it gets to a sort of a foundational point, and this is something I had in talking with senior Korean officials in the hours leading up to my testimony, because they were very cognizant that I was going to talk about Korea and Korea was going to be raised, is that this is broader than just coupon, which is, I think, a central point here. Like these are historical issues. You talk to some of these companies, like they've been getting targeted by the KFTC for over 10 years. And so putting it in that context. The broader context is also is that as it relates to competition policy is only one of several highly problematic digital non-tariff barriers faced in Korea. Mapping data, the Cloud Security Assurance Program, there's financial and payment data restrictions. And so you have all of these other issues, again, which are long-standing, which Korea hasn't addressed, even though the US has obviously raised them time and time again. And so the Korean trade officials wonder why they feel they're being targeted, or why they feel they have such a challenging sort of agenda ahead of them, is that because some of these things have been around for a long time and they haven't been able to get their attention on it. And so I think what makes this whole sort of dynamic interesting is that USTR Greer and the Trump administration have clearly put the Korean government on notice that digital non-tariff barriers are a priority for them, that they expect them to be addressed in the context of current trade talks, and that absent action, they will take action, likely in the form of a Special 301. And so that's while the Trump administration has pursued its trade objectives in a non-traditional sort of format without the usual redress mechanisms in the trade talks, they've clearly shown them what they plan to use, and that they will be willing to use it if they don't feel that Korea comes to the table and addresses these long-standing concerns about digital non-tariff barriers issues. And so that's essentially where we're at. There are ways to square the circle on this. We, in our first briefing, which you can read outside, basically repurposed a lot of provisions that already exist in USMCA that would sort of buttress existing provisions within Chorus that would provide the procedural fairness protections and legal redress protections that US firms would want. So the solution also is not new. And we had the opportunity while doing this to talk with former USDR officials who were involved in these talks 10 years ago. Again, so this is not new, the solution is there, but we obviously just need that political will to bring it to bear in the context of the current increasingly increasingly dramatic context. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion and any questions. I realise this is a timely discussion given everything that's going on at the moment.
I just want to add one thing to, and I agree with everything Nigel said. At the end of each year, the president meets with his regulatory heads. And when Lee Jae-myung met with the Korea Fair Trade Commission head, the KFTC chairman said, I want to add 167 new staff. And the president said, no, you need more like 500. That was in December. Again, in January, President Lee is quoted as repeating that the KFTC needs 500, up to 500 new bodies. So to me, the signal is President Lee really wants a more muscular Korea Fair Trade Commission. And to every company, particularly the Korean chaebols, and we spoke with several of them when Doug and I were in Korea recently, they're nervous about this. And any American company who is of any size in Korea is very concerned. But I do want to point out, and I don't mean to be overly critical about the Korea Fair Trade Commission on their heavy-handed audits or their investigations. When one has a customs audit or a tax audit in Korea, it's exactly the same. The dawn raids, gathering as much information and taking up office space, the lack of procedural fairness or legal redress, that's how Korea does it. But I think it's really time in Korea's development for Korea to look at global best practices. Does this approach still serve Korea? And I would argue, particularly in looking at the KFTC, that perhaps it doesn't, that maybe it's time to change their system a little bit.
Now, which actually gets at a central point with this, that this is not about competition policy per se, but its application. In that when you look at what Korea does in the broader global context, it's set apart in several key ways. In terms of the heavy-handed frequent use of dawn raids, which are typically a tool to sort of like save evidence from being destroyed, whereas in in Korea it's just a common occurrence. The fact that in Korea officials can be criminally investigated after civil proceedings have ended, which is very unique globally, and the depth and breadth of the information requests that US firms face in Korea sets it apart from global best practices. During the interviews we had, they're like, basically the burden of a Korean investigation exceeds what they face in every other jurisdiction, including the EU. And which is compounded by the fact they're given absurdly short deadlines to sometimes react to some of these things. And so part of the challenge in doing this report was like, when we say this to Korean firms, they're like, oh yeah, we're just used to the KFTC acting like this all the time. And I've characterised it as a sort of Stockholm syndrome-like situation. But for US firms, when they're able to directly compare it against how they're being treated, often for the same issue or the same conduct in other markets simultaneously, they can see how they're being set apart and how they're being targeted in a way compared to how they even face competition authorities in the EU. And so I think that's a key point to reinforce here, is that it's about getting Korea in line with global best practices, and that the US trade talks are an opportunity to create some of those protections for procedural fairness, which they'd already tried to make in previous chorus consultations, which have proven insufficient and ineffective, to finally give US firms a defensive footing that, regardless of what the KFTC comes at them with, they know they have access to legal mechanisms to defend themselves more forcefully than they've been able to do in the past. And that's essentially the sort of the end goal here.
Well, I could just let you two keep going back and forth, but we do want to have some time for questions. So I'll take the moderator's prerogative to ask a couple, but then we also welcome questions from the audience. If you do have questions, I kind of ask you to line up on that wall over there, and then you can come up to the mic and ask your question. But starting off with one for you, Tami, is, we've got a lot of kind of uncertainty from the U.S. side regarding the broader kind of trade and, trade negotiation outcomes and, in fact, the ongoing negotiations. I want to kind of drill down into the commitments that Korea made in the joint fact sheet, very positive commitments in a lot of ways. In the context of all of this uncertainty, what do you think Korea's options are to keep moving forward with those commitments from a kind of legislative policy perspective, and how do you think they should move forward with that?
That's a great question, Jonathan. So in the November joint text that came out as a result after the Lee-Trump summit in Gyeongju in October 29th, Korea agreed, both countries agreed to not discriminate or have policies that treated U.S. tech companies unfairly. And I think there is a real question and concern in the U.S. administration that Korea is backtracking on that. So I think to me, the obvious thing would be to stop digging the hole, put the shovel down. The National Assembly is talking about a new law on disaster management. And I understand why they want this law. For those of you who don't follow Korea closely, one of their data centers I think it was a cacao data center, had a horrible fire and caused incredible disruption in Korea. So I understand the need for the National Assembly to get involved. But unfortunately, often when we see new pieces of legislation like this, they end up disproportionately impacting large American companies. And often to sort of giving Chinese firms who are growing in Korea kind of a free pass. And that's something that really irritates the Trump administration. So stop making the problem worse. And again, resolving, as Nigel said in his reports, has very eloquently stated about a lot of these problems are not new. I mean, when I left Korea in 2009, we were talking about them. We're still talking about them. I can't, I'm sorry, Priscilla, Google Maps, full functionality. So, when my nephew is 23 now, but when he was like 9 or 10, he was obsessed with a Pokemon thing that you could do on Google Maps. And you couldn't use it, that functionality didn't work in Korea. But one of his little friends said, well, my mom took me to the East Coast to the Sokcho, and we could pick up the Japan signal. So my sister had to drive that little boy like 4 hours one way, give him an hour to get some of his little, whatever they were getting, I don't know, and then drive back. And she's like, I don't care what you do, but you better fix this problem. I'm not doing that again. We're still talking about it. Again, Korea last year hosted a very significant APEC meeting. But do you know what was in the U.S. handbook for all U.S. participants? You cannot use full functionality on your Google Maps. What that means to me when I'm in Korea, I can't because I use Google Maps for everything. I want to know how long it's going to take me to get from this building to where my next meeting is. Priscilla's company is going to tell me. Well, in Korea, they don't tell me, so I'm really mad at her. You need to fix this. But really, the Korean government needs to fix it. Now, my Korean friends, they say, oh, it's a national security issue. Tami, we don't even have a peace treaty with North Korea. That's true. You know who else has really tough security issues? Taiwan, Israel. But both of those countries found creative ways to resolve it. I'm confident the Korean government could if they wanted to. It's time. We need some good news.
All right, and then for you, Nigel, just to kind of kick this discussion off, what do you think the you've talked about how this is a kind of longstanding, recurring issue in the Korean regulatory space. What do you think could be an effective signal that could give U.S. firms some kind of certainty that not only are their immediate concerns being addressed, but that we aren't just going to be back in this space in 6 months, a year, 2 years?
No, and it gets to Tami's point in that if the Korean government wants a good faith reaction from the United States government and firms in reaction to new legislative proposals, they need to address the longer standing concerns to give them that space to do that. But if new concerns come up to add to old concerns, then understandably US firms and the US government are just going to sort of react to them poorly. And so it's about using the provisions we've seen in many other agreements, some of them for a long time, to actually address some of these long-standing concerns and basically, in essence, give US firms a fair deal in Korea, which they thus far don't feel they have in relation to mapping data, in relation to cloud procurement for the Korean government, as it relates to financial payment data and services, and then obviously as it relates to competition policy. Whereas if they feel that there's been both a change in tenor and treatment, that they can give Korean policymakers the benefit of the doubt whenever the new legislative proposals start coming up. And what it also lays the basis for is like broader cooperation on cybersecurity, AI, semiconductors, whatever it may be. Whereas if both firms from both countries feel that there's obviously a clear benefit for them in both countries because they're being treated fairly, they're seen as a trusted partner, that they will commit even more investment and more cooperation in these initiatives in these countries. And so, I mean, ideally, and I mean, it's hard to do this, like as a former sort of trade negotiator and economist, it's like, well, just reset and weigh up each issue on the cost benefit of it all. But there needs to be a reset of some sort to address some of these long-standing issues, to show flexibility, to show a new level of pragmatism to get at some of these concerns in a way that we just haven't seen yet. And that change might spark further changes further along. It might be a cascading effect of sorts. Whereas if both sides dig in even further, it only makes the prospect of achieving some sort of middle ground that much harder. And so, I mean, the Trump administration and the US government, given how long these issues, have made their concerns clear for a long time. There are solutions all over the place to apply. Mapping data, solutions, competition policy, solutions. It's just a matter of getting these together. And I mean, in some ways, talking to a senior Korean official, and I was putting it in this broader context, and you could just see that they did an amazing job of like providing the Korean government's perspectives and interests. But it's like, you could see that the challenges they were dealing with, and like, you're asking me to go back and talk to these domestic agencies about what they should be doing to address some of these concerns, and they clearly don't feel they have the political authority to do that. And so there needs to be a reset of some sort to focus on pragmatic solutions to deal with some of these longer standing things, so that the two sides can focus on the issues now that are much more sort of relevant in terms of AI and cybersecurity and semiconductors in China.
So Cloud Services Access Program, CSAP. US cloud service providers are only able to tap into a very tiny part of the public sector market. So that means most of the Korean government is not using the US cloud services. And I know when I talk to my friends in the Korean military, and I'm like, I would be worried if I were you, because the US military uses the US services. We use many of the US providers because their security is so good. And at some point, I wonder if the US military isn't going to ask the Koreans, what about interoperability? Yeah. You're using Korean cloud, which may or may not be as secure, but it's not the same interoperability. The other point, and I think we're making a little bit of progress in that area, but then I heard that my friends at the National Intelligence Service have some new requirements, and one of them is a local presence. They want, you want our our government business, you have to build data centers in our country. Well, the reality is with 51 million people, it's not going to be likely economically, it's not going to make economic sense for these companies to do it. But for the Korean companies, sure, they can put a small data center there. And I fear that these issues will, the goalposts keep moving. As soon as the companies meet one requirement, suddenly a new requirement is established. And again, I think I sense a real frustration from not just the U.S. companies, but the U.S. regulators, the administration, whether it's the U.S. Trade Representative, whether it's the White House, the State Department, people are just, or Congress. Another Korean problem, really? I think it really would help Korea to get some wins. And by wins, I mean solve some of these problems. As Nigel said, they're not unsolvable. We know how to do it, but they need the political, and I think it's going to have to come from the president.
Yeah. And one further point that Tami raises that's worth reinforcing, too often in the debate, people dismiss concerns about digital non-tariff barriers of you just don't like regulation per se. And that's not the case here, is that in Korea, there's example after example of Korea-specific unique restrictions that don't exist anywhere else. The mapping data is an example. The cloud requirements is another one where they require firms to use a Korea-specific algorithm in providing security. So instead of using best-in-class international technical standards, they want firms to use a Korean-specific algorithm. And that's like a classic technical non-tariff barrier to trade. And so it's again, and then, hearing about these new requirements and proposals sort of already makes my head explode. It just makes it challenging to get a fresh start when there's just new things that pop up in a already sort of challenged context, when solutions exist elsewhere. And so, the final point is on the cloud stuff is particularly concerning because you have this new infrastructure bill. And Korea's taken the opposite reaction to developments in relation to the Ukraine's shift to the cloud and how other countries view the cloud as a source of resilience. Korea's taken the opposite turn in that with this infrastructure bill where there was a major fire at a data center, instead of getting more firms into the cloud because of its resilience, they want more firms just to store it locally. So, which
and
seems...
it defeats the purpose.
It's counterproductive. And so it just makes the context for finally addressing these issues more challenging when new issues keep on popping up.
You have a question. You've been very patient.
Yes, we do want to get time for audience questions, so please continue to line up along the wall and feel free to come forward, state your name and affiliation and your question.
Oh, well, thank you. My name's Tom Ramage, and I'm with the Korea Economic Institute. Thank you for your wonderful discussion today. I have a three-pronged question. I'll try to keep it short. So the first is during the July Trump round deal, I would say famously with the EU deal, they talked about digital services in it, although the EU kind of questioned if that was the case. But then when President Trump met with Lee Jae-myung, the initial statement they put out didn't cover digital services, although Trump later in that evening said he would tariff countries that discriminate against American technology companies. So my first question is, why didn't the original trade deal just cover digital services if this was so important between the two leaders? Who knows if they talked about it over their luncheon. Later on, of course, with the fact sheet that came out, they agreed that they would not discriminate against American technology companies. So is this a question of whether or not Korea is actually doing this? Second, if Korea agrees through bilateral negotiation with the Trump administration to address this issue, what power does the Korean president actually have to change things in the KFTC or in legislation in the National Assembly? Can he actually do anything, or is this domestic level? And then third, with the two investors, and I think it's maybe more now, that invested in Five now. The five investors in Coupang, in their petition to USTR, They made some allegations that Korea or the Korean president was doing this actually to benefit Chinese companies. And my question is, why are they bringing China into this? Thank you.
You want to go first?
Yeah,
and
I'll
follow in?
take the first one. Digital has obviously been a part of the negotiations from the start. The key question with the Trump administration throughout this, regardless of whether it's Korea or other countries, is does digital make the cut when they actually get to announcing initial framework agreements and then obviously in subsequent sort of finalised talks. We've seen that dynamic play out across multiple countries, most recently with Indonesia, where it actually has led to specific concrete provisions that have seen through at the end. And so I think the initial joint statement flagged it. The proof is in the pudding of what does that actually mean in practice. We're still waiting to hear what that actually looks like. In that they've obviously made it a target, and so what do they get to address it? I mean, some of the same concerns in Korea apply in the EU, and I've seen a list of since they made their commitment not to discriminate against US firms, there's 6 new things that the EU has enacted that create new problems for US firms. And so this is not a unique thing. The longer these talks drag out, the more likely new issues get swept up into them. But I think digital is clearly a priority. After all my talks around DC with all the various agencies and Congress, that clearly seems to be the case. I think with Korea, with the KFTC, it's eminently within his authority and power to do. The first time where the two sides tried to address part of the competition issue, they enacted an amendment to the Korea's main competition bill. That was insufficient and ineffective. And so it's as much as he is cheering them on to grow and expand and sort of empire build and do more of what they're already doing, he could obviously tell them to change course and change direction. So we just have not seen any signal in and around those types of objectives.
I would add that the Korean president's party has majority share of the National Assembly. And he leads the party, so he could direct them. He also can fire and hire the KFTC chairman at will. And regarding the question on China, I think there has been a fair amount of speculation that President Lee Jae-myung leans more towards China than the United States. I don't necessarily buy into that because I think he has been very pragmatic, especially with the warming with Japan relations. And I feel he really understands, and he's been quite clear about the U.S. is he feels that special relationship with the U.S. So, but I do think that sometimes, again, some of the National Assembly legislation does look like it doesn't capture the Temu, Xi'an, AliExpress. So to me, that does look like some folks are giving room for China to grow. And again, the president, if he wanted to influence his party, I believe he could.
But on the China point, it came up in the context of our interviews in that there's just emerging concerns about how the KFTC has done some of its investigations and such, and that which are designed to capture US firms but leave out Chinese firms who have often set up sort of joint ventures with Korean chaebols. And so they've seen sort of early sort of worrying signs where they've purposely drawn the lines of some of these investigations and hearings and research projects that seem to sort of capture them but not their new Chinese competitors. And so that's concerning, but we haven't seen, at a broader level, haven't seen sort of the alarm bells go off about there's a clear sort of indicative effort to just favour Chinese firms. It's just this warring tendency. And I mean, it gets to also a point that US firms make is that with the KFTC, they have the authority to basically investigate anyone or no one, and it can be based off a single anonymous sort of complaint. And we've seen in other areas where the KFTC has gone after US firms, even though they hold a insignificant portion of the market share, but they're in a market where there's a established chaebol with the majority. And so we obviously haven't seen any similar initiation of scrutiny, even though Chinese firms are may only be small players, whereas US firms, they can get KFTC attention at any point in time.
Thank you all very much. Scott Thompson with Samsung. And you all were just starting to get into this, I think, kind of a two-part question that starts from this philosophical, but it gets toward the tangible for a good reason, I hope, as you'll see. Essentially, if you could elaborate on some of those recent comments, why does the KFTC, with President Lee's assent, do what it does? From our company's standpoint, it would be for the benefit, by and large, of Korean small and medium-sized enterprises with a little bit more amorphous of a goal of Korean consumer protection behind it, but hazily so. I bring up those points to say if the U.S. government, and other governments for that matter, who are disproportionately affected by this, want to use a cudgel to make changes, that cudgel, particularly in the Trump administration's mind, seems to be additional tariff threats and maybe impositions. As a company who makes a lot of stuff but does not operate directly in the digital platform space, but rather benefits from U.S. digital platform companies, that would seem to be does the punishment fit the crime here, or at least the allegation of a crime? And if it does not, what might the alternative cudgels look like? Yeah. It seems to me that if we are talking about restricting access to the Korean marketplace for U.S. or other multinational platform-oriented companies, perhaps the appropriate response, imperfect as it may be, would be to restrict access to the U.S. Digital space in return for Korean companies who might like access to the world's largest economy for those purposes, as opposed to penalizing makers of stuff and the U.S. consumers who buy those types of stuff. Question mark. Thanks.
The first part of your question, it's a fascinating question we tried to address in our second report, where we look at the institutional, cultural, historical role of the KFTC, which was obviously created in terms of protecting SMEs and consumers in the presence of large chaebols, right? But what we, in terms of, in this piece, getting at the point of how we look at what the KFTC has done, breaching the threshold of being protectionist, in that there's obviously a clear pattern, but there's a cultural, social, political dynamic at play here that lends to the KFTC being seen and actually doing so very strong, very proactive, very aggressive in what it does. And when US firms occupy some of the most prominent positions in these digital markets, they then find themselves in the firing line. And so one of the things that was sort of a secondary topic in our interviews was what powers the KFTC to do what it does? And it's every year there's the National Assembly audit and we just know we're going to get called up and we're just going to be put through the fire there. They need to be seen to be tough. The media is egging them on to be tough. And then the policymakers obviously factor into it as well. And so there's this sort of constant momentum for them to keep doing more. And US firms are prominent, and so it feeds into it. So that's a long way to say that there are many factors that contribute to the dynamic that has led to the KFTC doing what they're doing. That's not to say that it's completely within the president's power to sort of ensure that, if nothing else, there are some safeguards about how this momentum plays out in practice. The second part is a fascinating one that we're now facing more closely than we have probably in prior administrations in terms of does the punishment fit the crime? What we've seen in the EU context is USTR released a list of major EU digital service firms that they may target as a reciprocal response to US firms, digital firms being targeted in Europe. So that may be where we get to. I mean, anyone that works on trade is in chaos at the moment, trying to figure out what comes next after the Supreme Court decision. in what mix of, and I mean, Tami was going through the 122, the 301s, the 232s, and like,
238s,
and how do they come together in the aggregate to get to what we had just before, a week ago? How that plays out in digital will be really interesting to see. Like, I mean, I highly suspect there will be a digital specific 301, if not country specific 301s. And so like, it'll be interesting to see what remedies are considered as they go about figuring out, okay, how do we square the circle in terms of trade remedies with Korea versus India versus Indonesia, and like, what does that look like? So I don't know, wait and see, but I think we're getting closer to truer reciprocity as it relates to digital, given some of the early signals we've seen from USTR.
I would just add, I don't think President Lee is anti-foreign business, but I do think he might be anti-big business. And that's going to start with the chaebols, so sorry for y'all. But you know, we're right, the U.S. companies are right there, they're next. So yeah, and I do think it's, in his mind, it's about protecting the small and medium-sized companies. Ironically, who use the platforms that, you know, he wants to whack. So, other questions? Or you got more for us?
Yes, please come up to the mic.
Hello, my name is Jiyoung Hong from Segue Times, Washington correspondent, and I understand today's discussion is the broader story than Kupang issue, but somehow the Kupang issue is dominating the discussion between the U.S. and about the trade issues between the U.S. and South Korea. And actually, I think this has been somehow this has been facilitated by the U.S. politicians. I was in the hearing in the Congress, and Nigel, you were there, yeah, and I felt that the politicians did not isolate those two different issues about digital regulation and Kupang issues. So I don't see any exit strategy from now on. So I think 301 investigation could be started because the Trump administration wants that, regardless of Kupang. But all Korean people would perceive that that is because of Kupang. So this is very complicated story. So do you see any solution or exit strategy for this issue? Yeah.
That's a great question, and I will tell you the advice I give my Korean government friends and Kupang. For Kupang, I tell them their founder needs to go to Korea. He needs to go to the National Assembly and give his apology there, as SK Chairman Chae Tae-won did, and J.Y. Lee of Samsung whenever they did anything that upset the general Korean public. And then what the Korean government should do, from my perspective, is of the 11 regulatory investigations going on now, only 2 have to do with data and cybersecurity. Those other 9 are unrelated. Labor, customs, tax, FSS, anybody who touches them is investigating. I think all of those are discriminatory, in my opinion, and should be cut. I also think that criminal charges against the interim CEO should be dropped. You know, so from my position, both sides need to do something. And Kupang could also make the chairman, after he made his apology, could then donate money to bring the best U.S. cybersecurity minds together with the best Korean cybersecurity minds, create a forum to help resolve future data leak problems, because this isn't the last. There will be more. One thing that we've seen in Korea after tragedies, for example, the Itaewon Halloween October crush, after that horrible tragedy, Korea did so many things to ensure that would never happen again, and they're sharing that information with other countries. And to me, out of every tragedy should come an opportunity. And I want to see an opportunity where Korea and the U.S. working together in technology, where we have so many common issues, so many common strengths, that should be what we remember.
I think the coupon case, while highly dramatic for the context, is symptomatic of what US firms have faced for a long time. It's just, I mean, the timing of it in the context of talks has just given it obviously a extra few levels of attention. But I mean, their experience is parallel, like the interviews we did with all the other firms. So they, in many ways, highlight the underlying issues while obviously providing broader complications of, given it's obviously been clearly politicized and therefore makes it harder to address. So, I mean, I think Tami's solutions all make sense to me.
You also mentioned members of Congress sort of confuse everything. Every member of Congress has companies in their district who are using coupon as a way to reach out to Korean consumers. When you go to the coupon office, they have this beautiful wall of, it looks like maybe hundreds of American logos. All of those companies are using coupon to reach out to the 51 million Korean consumers. And so you can get any member of Congress to care because they have companies in their district. And again, I mentioned I am one of Coupon's many consultants. I think they've done an extraordinarily good job of making sure everyone in the U.S. now knows who Coupon is and knows Coupon's side of the story.
The last point is that the challenge in addressing the underlying issue in the context of a charged political environment around a sort of related corporate case is not unique to Korea, given what we see in the EU with US tech firms being targeted there, in the media, in the limelight, in ways that, again, have been there for a long time. And so it's challenging, but it's not unique. In that it's just a matter of the two sides and negotiators getting together and figuring out how can they come together in a pragmatic fashion to address sort of like some manner of the issues they're facing. So,
but they need to be talking, both sides. And unfortunately, this is taking a lot of the oxygen out of the room for good things, wonderful things. How much in 2023 and 2024, the largest foreign investor in the United States were South Korean firms. This is before the $350 billion investment pledge. So South Korea is already you're bringing your best technology here, whether it's in shipbuilding, in semiconductors, in autos, in batteries, in solar. That story's not being told because all we're hearing about is a big problem. So both sides need to come together, find a constructive solution, and let's focus on the positives. This is a great relationship. We need to be working together. Sir, you've been very patient.
Hi, I'm Seung-jin Choi from Mail Business newspaper in South Korea, and actually I've been working as a reporter for 20 years and for Economic Daily, and I also covered KFTC for 2 or 3 years, and so I agree with the opinion of Mr. Cory's opinion. So, in some point, so there has been a huge controversy on the way of investigation in KFTC. So, so I think, so we all know that there is a problem for KFTC, but I want to ask to Mr. Cory, they are also aggressive to Korean companies. The SK chairman Choi Tae-won also went to jail because of KFTC, and in some point for me, the KFTC is more aggressive to South Korean companies. So what I want to ask is, do you think it is discrimination for U.S. companies?
Yeah, a great question. I mean, it was really funny to hear during our interviews when everyone would agree, like the KFTC also goes after Korean firms, maybe not with the same consistency or vigor they go after US firms, but Korean firms are often their targets. But a key thing is that for Korean firms, they see constant KFTC investigations as just a cost of doing business. And the refrain we got multiple times reflecting this point was like, oh, it's better to just go along, don't fight too hard, pay the fine and go along and just keep going on. And that was their sort of general default setting. Whereas US firms obviously approach this, each case on its merits, defend themselves through to the end. And a key point in our analysis that separates what Korea does domestically and elevates it to becoming discriminatory is when you compare how US firms are treated in Korea compared to all the other jurisdictions. And that's where, again, Korea, that's where it sort of breaks through and becomes discriminatory in terms of there are many unique parts of what Korea does and how it does it with the KFTC where it does become protectionist. And for US firms can see that difference because they're often facing the same investigation across multiple jurisdictions. And so they can see how they're treated or not compared to Korea. And again, like one of the comments we got during our interviews was like, the burden and the frequency of what we get from the KFTC is like their biggest headache as it relates to jurisdictions in comparison to others around the world. And that was they just said it's just a constant battle. And there are other unique factors in Korea. It's the attorney-client privilege is not in Korea isn't the same as it is in the US. The depth and breadth of information and data requested, often including source code, is highly problematic and sets them apart. The potential for criminal investigations, again, is really, really unusual. The lack of legal redress in Korea also sets them apart from the US, EU, and Japan and others. And so that all comes together when you put it into the global context, sort of sets them apart, and that's where it becomes protectionist. Whereas I feel the Korean firms, again, often investigated, but the other part of what we say in the paper is like, Korean firms go along with it because there's clearer direct benefits more broadly for them of having a generally cooperative relationship with the government in terms of industrial policy and such that US firms don't have the same access to. So the cost-benefit analysis of them and how they react to the KFTC is just different to US firms as well, because chaebols often have partnerships with the Korean government in many sort of different areas that relates to sort of national goals.
I have a little bit of a different perspective, and I think it's because I lived in Korea for 21 years. Absolutely, from my perspective, they go after the chaebols more than anyone. I also think that it's partly, and it's not just the KFTC, the National Tax Service, the customs, the way Korean regulatory bodies do their investigations are very different than in other jurisdictions. And to me, it's not, they're not discriminating against American or Korean firms. That's just how they do it. What I would argue is that the time has come for Korea to maybe elevate it and maybe improve it a little bit. Look around at your neighboring jurisdictions like Japan, Taiwan, Singapore. How do they do it? Again, there's a reason Korea isn't really a regional hub yet. You know, when companies started leaving China and de-risking, most of them went to Singapore. A couple, I think we have maybe 100 regional firms in Korea, but there should be so many more because of the Chorus Free Trade Agreement, which guarantees so many, it creates so much more certainty for business. But I think just, you know, again, we forget how new democracy is. And you know, before 1987, the Korean government, it was a command-controlled economy. The government chose the winners and the losers. But now it's an open market. But it's hard for the regulators to really let go and let the market decide. From my perspective, they still want to hold on to that. But from my perspective, it's not helping Korea anymore. Again, it really, I mean, it's about more than just the U.S. and Korea. It's about how does Korea compare to Japan, to Singapore, to Taiwan, to other markets.
And just last point, building on that, is indicative of US firms' perception of Korea is that it's seen as a high-risk compliance market. And so when it comes to the global rollout of new services and technologies, they will often pause, delay, or avoid rolling it out in Korea given what they suspect will be the regulatory reaction. So that's sort of like the cause and effect. And then Korean policymakers complain that they're not included in the latest rollout, and they ask why, and they go, well, because this is why, in terms of the KFTC, and yet they don't put those 2 points together. But I think that's a clear indicator of how US firms see their treatment in Korea as being different from what they see in other jurisdictions where they face the same regulatory scrutiny.
All right, well, I'll take the privilege to do one last lightning round question. I'll ask Tami to put on your chorus champion hat, Nigel to put on your trade negotiator hat. What would a durable, politically sustainable solution to the current spat, the current back and forth look like for both governments in the digital and trade space? And I'll add the rule that you're not allowed to say the word coupon. Just more broadly.
Frankly, I'm done thinking about coupon for today. They've earned their money. I would go to Nigel's paper, and under the U.S.-Mexico agreement, there are several good examples that could be added to the Chorus FTA that would be a win-win for both. So I would encourage everybody to read Nigel's report, and to some of my Korean friends, maybe read it twice. I don't mean that disrespectfully, I really don't.
The solutions are there, they exist in other agreements. What we proposed was not new, and again goes at addressing the underlying sort of administrative and institutional concerns as opposed to like Korean law per se. But it's a matter of obviously Korean policymakers agreeing to new guardrails, new safeguards in how the KFTC does what it does. But that these provisions reflect best practice and in essence reflect the underlying need that US firms just want to be able to defend themselves should they fall under investigation. That's in that they're going to be treated fairly and that they have access to legal redress as they do it. That's the core of what our recommendations lay out. Again, and this is not new, these are not new sort of ideas or provisions. We've repurposed them from elsewhere, and so, but obviously getting them from pre-existing paper into practice is obviously a clear matter of political will and attention.
And I worry with 500 new KFTC investigators that the president wants, a more muscular Korea Fair Trade Commission, I worry about that. Not just for American companies, but for chaebols and for really all companies operating in Korea.
All right, well, and on that happy note, that optimistic note, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank in particular Tami and Nigel for contributing their insights, Nigel for leading this year-long research initiative. It's the first of what we hope are many fruitful projects looking at Indo-Pacific digital regulation and related topics. I want to thank my NBR colleagues Doug, Jerome, Fern, and Audrey for helping to bring this event together. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. We obviously all have a lot going on in the U.S. ROK trade and tech space, so thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. And if we could give a round of applause to our excellent panelists.
Thank you.